All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeff with Fluent American, and we're going to again be taking a look at a task 2 prompt for an IELTS essay. I'm going to post the link so you can follow along with me. And if you have questions, feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to discuss in more detail. Okay. So I just posted, whoops, wrong link. Give me 1 sec. I'm going to post this. Okay, so this is a Google Doc, so that way you can access the essay as we go through it, and that you can kind of follow along. And if you have questions for me as we go through, of course, be sure to let me know. I'll also post the text in the comments as well. Might be a little bit messy, but at least if you can't access Google Docs, it'll give you something that you can follow along with, which is better than nothing. Give me one moment to do that. Let's make it a little bit shorter. 200 words. Yeah, it's not going to let me do that. Sorry, guys. So again, I would suggest looking at the Google Doc. I can post some screenshots if you're on our Facebook. I'll send some pictures on there so that way you can kind of see what the essay looks like as well, if you look at our Facebook page. So this is going to be an essay that has 2 parts. That has basically, we're going to be describing a cause, and we're going to be trying to give a solution. Just posting the screenshots in Facebook. Okay, so basically you can see the question says, what has caused the rise in obesity among children, and how can this problem be solved? So we're going to be 2 things for this essay. We need to look at, firstly, basically a cause, what's caused the problem, and then after that we need to give a solution. What is something that we can do to help fix this? So we're going to begin by looking at our first paragraph, the intro. Once I just finish posting that, great. Okay, so you can also, if you're on our Facebook page, you can just look up Fluent American Accent Reduction. You'll be able to see the essay there, and I'll be talking through it as well if you can't access the Google Doc. So our introduction says, so technological developments post-World War II have revolutionized how youngsters spend their free time. Just a quick note, youngsters is more of a British term, I would say. So you could also say like kids, you could also say children. These are just other options that you have, youngsters. I think there's other ways to express that too that might be more common, at least in the US. Technological developments post-World War II have revolutionized how these people spend their free time. Well, in the past, they would spend time in the open air playing sports. Today, they're more likely to be at home gawking at a screen. This essay will discuss how this trend will lead to childhood obesity. Okay. So let's start off with this thesis statement right here. So the thesis statement is basically the sentence that describes what your whole essay is about. So when this says this essay will discuss how this trend can lead to childhood obesity, I would suggest making this more specific. Okay, so instead of saying this essay will express this trend, I would say what is the actual trend that we're discussing. So if I look really quick down at the first paragraph, okay, so it basically looks like it's about activity. So like this essay will discuss how this trend can lead to childhood obesity, maybe like due to decreased levels of activity. Okay. I would also suggest removing saying this essay will discuss. That doesn't really add much. You don't need to tell me that you're writing an essay as you're writing an essay. So I would suggest removing basically that line. You don't need to say like, oh, in this essay, I will say, or in my opinion, or I will argue, things like that. These things are not really necessary. You don't need to tell me when you're writing an essay that you're writing an essay. It's completely unnecessary. So I would go right to your point. I would just say for your thesis statement, this trend can lead to childhood obesity due to decreased levels of activity. Then our next point, so what parents should do to avoid this. Okay, so I'm going to look down at our body paragraph that talks about the solution, and we can see that greater parental control. Okay, so my suggestion would be to, instead of saying what parents should do to avoid this, I would suggest saying, so this trend can lead to childhood obesity due to decreased levels of activity, and maybe take off the and, maybe like, but it doesn't want to do that. So let's try here. But can be resolved by increasing parental controls or monitoring, things like that. Okay, so now I have a sentence that directly answers my question. How are we going to solve this problem? Well, we're going to do it by increasing parental control. Okay, so you want your thesis statement to be as specific as possible. If there's anything you take from this, is that try to make your thesis statement super specific. You don't want it to be very general. So again, it's going to lead to childhood obesity due to decreased levels of activity. How's it going to be resolved? Increasing parental control. So you have a sentence now in your thesis statement that is directly talking about your question. You have a cause, and then you talk about how to solve it. That's ideally what you want in your thesis. You want a sentence that directly answers the question. And again, you don't need to say things like, in my opinion, or in this essay, things like that. Completely unnecessary. Okay. In terms of the first sentence, this is called your hook. So the first sentence of an intro is called a hook. The goal is to generate interest in the topic. I see a lot of students that write very general sentences. They'll say things like nowadays, or in these modern times, or recently. In those types of sentences, it's very general. They may say like obesity among children has grown, like really general sentences that are very similar to the prompt and not very helpful. My suggestion would be to actually try to give a sentence that that engages your reader, that makes them want to read more. It's like technological developments post World War II. I think the post World War II is interesting. Have revolutionized. You could probably push this even more. Instead of saying technological developments, what else could you say? Well, you could say things like, I don't know, the TV. Then, I don't know, the first, what was the first video game? Like the first Atari console, if anyone out there had an Atari, which was a video game back in like the 80s. The first, and followed by the internet, something like that. Like all of these are, or like all of these post World War II advancements have revolutionized how youngsters spend their free time, how kids spend their free time. Yeah, I think that is a little bit more engaging of an intro for me than what we originally started with. Okay, so that's just a quick what you want your hook to do. You want your hook to introduce the topic, while also kind of getting them, your reader, interested in seeing more about what's going to happen in the essay. To tie this in with the prompt more, you could even add, so like advancements have revolutionized how youngsters spend their free time, but not always in a positive way. Okay. Maybe like regarding their health and weight. Actually, since this essay is focused on weight, let's just keep it on weight. So obesity is referring to weight, so I'll just say weight. The TV, then the first Atari console, and then followed by the internet. All these post-World War II advancements have revolutionized how Children spend their free time, but not always in a positive way regarding their weight. While in the past, they would spend time in the open air playing sports, they are more likely to be at home. This trend can lead to childhood obesity due to decreased levels of activity, but can be resolved by increasing parental monitoring. Great. Okay, so this is our intro. Okay, I think for an intro, this would work pretty well. We're going to now take a look at the next paragraph, the first body paragraph. Okay. So the increase of screen time among children today, along with corresponding decrease in time, this should be spent on outdoor recreational activities, a significant contributor to childhood obesity. Okay. So I'm expecting this paragraph to talk about increased screen time. So this seems pretty important right here. And then decrease in time spent outdoors. So I'm expecting two things. Let's see what actually happens. Okay. So TV and computers, and perhaps to a large extent smartphones, promote a sedentary lifestyle. Okay. So increase the screen time. This inactivity means that children are burning enough calories on a daily basis. Okay, so one thing I think that we need to prove first of all is that so we mentioned earlier increase in screen time. So we probably need to mention how this is increasing. TV and computers, and perhaps in a large extent smartphones, promote a sedentary lifestyle. Maybe like is becoming like more common. So maybe like viewers, let's see, this activity is children. Common, maybe like at the workplace and at home. Viewers typically sit in front of a monitor adults, schools for kids, and at home. Okay, because again, we're kind of focusing more on children. Viewers typically sit in front of a monitor or screen. Like, let's talk a little bit about time for multiple hours a day. This inactivity means that children are not burning enough calories on a daily basis. Okay, we need to explain this more. So you say this inactivity means that they're not burning enough. Why? Where's our proof? One of the things that I really encourage you when you're writing your body paragraphs is to always be considering proof. How are you proving what you're saying? So you have a sentence here so inactivity means they're not burning enough calories. Why is this true? So let's talk about that a little bit more. Basis as they maybe like as their bodies do not need to maybe like do not need to use much energy to maybe like to watch content. Okay. This means that children are not burning enough calories on a daily basis as their bodies not use much energy to watch content. The ultimate outcome of this. I said the ultimate outcome because this is a little bit too strong if you say the ultimate outcome, because that makes it sound like there's no other possibility. The only possibility that can happen is that students are going to have this issue. And that's just not the case. So I would suggest toning this down instead of saying the ultimate outcome. Maybe like one possible outcome. So that's something you just want to watch out for. in your writing is try to make sure you're not saying anything that's too strong or hard to prove. You know, not every child who basically is always on their phone will become obese. You know, some children may, but not every child. So we want to make sure that that is clear. Not this is not the case for everybody. Okay. So one possible outcome of this is childhood obesity. Okay. Then we give an example here. For example, in my father's generation, TVs are rare. It's quite rare to see. Okay, one quick thing. So you have rare right here. Oops. So you have the word rare here. And then you have the rare before it as well. So try to mix up your vocabulary, especially in one sentence. You don't want to repeat one word too often. Okay. So maybe instead of rare here, we could say something like uncommon. Okay, it was quite uncommon to see an overweight child. For example, in my father's generation, when TVs were rare and computers non-existent, it was quite uncommon to see an overweight child. This was because children both were on orbits spent a large part of the day playing outside. Okay. All right, so a couple things, and this is, I think, leads to a question that a lot of students ask me. They ask me, is it okay if um, is it all right if basically I have a personal example? In general, I don't think there's an issue with it, but I do think that in a lot of essays, it might sound better to make it a little bit more general. Okay, especially for a more academic style essay. Um, and I think in this case, it would be relatively easy to make it so. So, for instance, instead of saying, for example, in my father's generation, um, maybe you could say, um, like a generation or two ago, when TVs were rare and computers non-existent, it was quite uncommon to see an overweight child. This was because okay, quite uncommon. That's fine. You could also say it was less common or less usual, less typical. This was because I would maybe consider just like children in both rural and urban also spent a larger part of their day playing outside. Maybe like meaning they had more opportunities to burn calories. Okay. Actually, we mentioned burn calories earlier, and that's kind of a set phrase. So we don't want to overuse expressions. So maybe instead of saying burn calories, maybe like to get exercise and maybe said burn calories, maybe say like burn off fat and to get exercise and burn off fat. Okay, something like that. All right, so in general, a couple of just real quick improvements that we made to this paragraph. Okay, so I would say the biggest thing that we did was we tried to basically just give some more details about some of our points because I think just the way it was a little bit general. Okay. As I'm going through this, of course, feel free to send some questions if there's a specific paragraph that you'd like more information about or anything like that. Okay. Or a specific point that I haven't fully explained. Yeah, so that's our first body paragraph, and I think that would help. At the end of this, I'll also share some, again, you'll have the link to the essay so you can see it. I'll also, on our Facebook page, I'll post some pictures of what the final essay looked like. So that way you can kind of compare what we originally had with what our updated version became. Our next one. So while there are many solutions that may be submitted, I don't know if submitted is quite the right word. Who are we submitting to? So maybe instead of submitted, maybe like proposed. I think the most basic and practical solution is greater parental control over children's screen time. The problem starts at home, and therefore we should first look to the home for answers. Okay, so this is a big claim. The problem starts at home, and we should look to the home for answers. I think that's an interesting idea, but I think it does need some proof. Okay, so what we need to do here is we need to explain why this is true. So, like, the problem often starts at home. I would suggest making that a period. Let's describe this more. Why does it start at home? So maybe like, after all, this is where maybe like children develop their eating habits, daily routines, and notions about acceptable behavior, such as whether it is acceptable to spend hours staring at a phone or a television set. Okay. Therefore, should we just look at the phone? Okay, so this second half of this paragraph is kind of similar to what we saw earlier in that it's not giving any it's using personal examples. And again, personal examples fine. I personally would though suggest making it just a little bit more general and applicable. So we'll probably need to modify this a bit for that to happen. So therefore we should look to the first home for answers. I think this idea about having rules can be good for the monitoring and the controlling. Okay. So this second part will probably need to adjust quite a bit. Okay. After all, this is where children develop their eating habits. Okay. So how can we improve this paragraph? So like guidelines and strict rules for their kids to follow can create maybe like a healthy set of norms. And then maybe you can give some examples of those. Okay. Some common examples include maybe like limiting screen time to a specific hour of the night, or only allowing video games on weekends. Okay, so we're giving some examples of those norms. Okay, so again, you have a main idea. Okay, setting guidelines. Okay, so we have the guidelines here, and then we're giving an example of what some of those guidelines can be. Okay, and then we also want to mention like monitoring. So like additionally, or like an additional rule could be children have to use devices in the same room as a parent. And then talk about why in that way. Maybe like both parties or both people can be more aware. of each other's behavior. Okay. So again, we have basically a main idea here and then some details to go along with it just to reinforce it. Okay, so we took the same kind of idea that was mentioned here and we made it just a little bit more general. So instead of making it specific, like, oh, in my family, we did this, which can be a little bit difficult to prove and kind of just be made up. This is something that I think could work maybe a little bit better and sound a little bit stronger. Okay. So again, topic sentence. This whole paragraph is going to be talking about proposed solutions, parental control. And so everything about this is going to be about parental control. Okay. And we explain why. Well, it's because at the home, parents are the ones who determine the behavior. Okay. And then we could talk about what some of those guidelines are. And then we give some examples. Okay. So that's kind of just the general structure that we have for this paragraph, okay, for this essay. All right, after that, we have our conclusion. So in a word, excessive screen time among the youth will invariably contribute to higher. Maybe instead of invariably, I think that's a little strong. Also, same thing with the will. So I would just tone this down. Maybe like has the potential, maybe, to contribute to higher obesity rate. Solution pros. Okay. Maybe like parents. I'll take off the solution pros in this essay. Because again, in an essay, you don't need to tell me that you are writing an essay. It's not necessary. Parents can make an effort to put reasonable limits on screen time. This one simple solution applied sooner rather than later can preclude the need for invasive medical. Maybe we haven't talked about medical solutions later on, so I don't want to introduce a new concept. This is a key thing for conclusions. You don't want to introduce completely new information. That's not what you're aiming for. So instead, this one simple solution applied sooner rather than later can preclude children from maybe like developing weight issues later on in life. Something like that. Talk about things that you've mentioned before. The conclusion is not the time to add new information. We've never talked about medical solutions, so I would not suggest doing that here. Great. All right. So we've just taken a look at an essay. This is, again, a task 2. Basically, we're describing a cause and giving a solution. And yeah, so the key things we modified, we looked at the thesis statement. We made the thesis statement a little bit more specific to the essay. Okay, we mentioned things that this essay will actually talk about. We made sure that each body paragraph has a single focus. We also made sure that every main idea has details that ideally are as specific as possible. We also watched out for our vocabulary. We made sure that we're not repeating the same words too often. And we're trying to use as wide a range of vocabulary as possible, including things like idioms, expressions as well. So for instance, like burn calories. Also in our conclusion, we're trying not to add new information, just information that we've already had. And again, my name is Geoff. This is with Fluent American. I'm going to post some pictures in our Facebook group of the after essay. I'll remove all the things that we took out and things like that, so you can compare the original essay with the suggestions that we have. If you have questions about this, feel free to send me a message, leave a comment, and I'd be happy to hear your feedback. Great. So I hope you guys have a good day, have a good night, have a good afternoon, and I will see you next time. You guys take care.